What I'd like to expand on, I guess, is the aspect of spatial management and how I, at least, foresee that that's going to be a major component of how we manage nutrients down the road. I'd like to have you tell me what you see in this photograph. Well, not many tassels there. That might be why you think it looks like seed, yeah. Strips, okay. So you see an area where the crop is growing here where it's not there. What else? Okay, a hill. Well, if these are gaps where they're supposed to be, you did a good job cultivating that. Yeah, I remember being on the cultivator and my granddad asked, "Did you ever look behind you?" And it was sure a lot better if you didn't, I guess, but until he came along. Anymore with GPS and auto steer, we don't have to worry about those things, right? Well, a couple of things. I have no clue what this crop is. I just downloaded this off of a website. One thing I want you to look at is the topography. So you see an area of the field that is higher versus lower. And there's some rolling topography, so some areas that are going to shed or accumulate water. It may vary in their texture. The soils may vary related to depth as erosion or deposition has occurred. So there's a scale of natural variability that's evident in this photograph. And then there's also a scale of man-made variability, right? Because we've got, it looks like maybe there's 4 rows of whatever this crop is really close together. And then there's a gap and then another 4 rows. And I assume that's to allow a vehicle for transit or probably not irrigation since this is quite a slope here. Well, that's something I stress a lot in the classes that I teach, both with students and with farmers, is to always be aware of the sources and scales of variability that are existing in fields. So this illustrates 2 sources and scales of variability. One source is natural. One scale is natural, and the other source or scale is man-made. This is another photograph, and it may be a little harder to see with the lights up, but this is a field of corn here in Nebraska. One of our research sites, again, this is in Merritt County on a sandy soil, and we've created variability, but we also have natural variability here. So disregard this. This is our research applicator in the field with some people on it. But besides that, what do you see in this photograph?
It's very rolling.
Okay, some rolling topography, right?
Looks like there's an irrigation lateral run through it at one time with a drain towards the bottom of it.
Okay. You're kind of seeing something through here? Okay, I guess I'm not seeing that, but there might have been. I wouldn't guarantee that. This is center pivot irrigated now, and I doubt that it's ever been furrow with the rolling topography that it has.
Looks like some starved for nitrogen.
Okay, it's starved for N, that's right. And obviously indeficient in some spots. Well, again, this is actually the same cooperator that I showed you the picture before lunch on a different field in Merritt County. So we've got strips through here that have plenty of N up front and strips that have no fertilizer up front. So we've got through here, I believe it's 12 rows that had 75 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer applied at planting. And then there's 12 rows probably right here that had no fertilizer applied at planting. So we're seeing natural and man-made variability again. So this area of the field has what maybe we had thought would be enough N to get to this point. We're actually sensing the crop N status with this applicator and applying the fertilizer on the go here at, well, this would be a bit later than now. This is probably the last week in June, several years ago. But in this strip right here that has supposedly received the same amount of fertilizer, we're still seeing quite a range in crop color. So this is dark green, this is pretty light green through here. And that's due to either erosion or differences in organic matter that are leading to mineralization of N from that organic matter. The last thing to point out is this strip, whoops, sorry, get that. This running right through here. We'll see those in fields occasionally. Anybody guess what that is? It's a line, that's right. Not hearing the right answer yet. Lots of options. Well, the opposite of erosion, maybe, kind of. What do farmers sometimes do with pivot tracks? They fill them in. How do they do that? With a tillage operation, they have a little tiny disc that they go around and around in circles, right? Well, what you're seeing here is mineralization from that tillage operation. This farmer has filled in the pivot tracks, and the corn is about twice as tall where that tillage has occurred as to where it is not. As that tillage operation has stimulated mineralization, the aeration process has increased the rate of mineralization in those tracks. So it's something that's not really evident here where we've applied more fertilizer, but where the fertilizer is lacking, those areas really stand out. Particularly on this sandy soil, there is very little residual N from any previous fertilizers, so the mineralized N is really evident on this particular field. So again, a couple of examples of variability that occur in a field, both naturally and man-made. So, hopefully you may have been exposed to this concept of the 5 soil forming factors. And I think maybe we've alluded to those earlier today. Climate, organisms, parent material, relief, and time. And they can have somewhat different names, but these are the factors that result in soils differing between Nebraska and North Carolina. And they can also result in soils differing from this foot to the next foot, or this part of the field to the next part of the field. So these are the sources of natural variability. And then we add on top of that a whole host of factors that are management induced. It's interesting, we think we have a long-term history on fields here in Nebraska if we go back 50 years. I've not traveled near as extensively as John, but a few years ago I was at a conference in Denmark, and we had a field tour associated with that and visited a farmer's field, and this farm had been in the family a long time. And on the wall in his office, he had a map of the farm from, I believe it was 1725 or something like that. It was like 300 years ago. And it was lots of small fields. This was in Denmark, in northern Denmark. And he said today that is all one field where it had been 30 or so fields. And today the field boundaries are still evident from some of those fields that were 300 years ago. All those physical evidence have been taken away, the trees, the hedgerows and things like that, and yet the patterns in the crop still illustrate, in some years at least, where those hedgerows and fence rows and things like that were. So the impacts that we can have through management sometimes can be very long lasting. This is an example of natural variability. 2 scales or sources of variability. One is topography. So you see the rolling nature. This is a field in Hamilton County right adjacent to the Platte River. The Platte River runs right through here, and so the soils slope gradually down towards the river. And then overlaid on top of that is a map of soil apparent electrical conductivity. Now, John talked earlier about measuring electrical conductivity as a tool to assess soil quality or nutrient status. And we're finding that as a tool that we are using extensively now in our research, but also then farmers are using it as a tool to manage fields spatially. But they're not going out with a handheld probe that John has. They're going out with tools that can map on the go with a GPS positioning system so they know what part of the field they're getting these measurements in. So the areas that are high conductivity, the red areas here, are on the higher elevation part of the field. What would cause higher conductivity here versus lower conductivity down here? What are some things that you think might lead to that? What causes conductivity to be high or low?
Your soil texture changes because you're in a closer you get to the river, the more sand you have.
Okay, that's exactly right. Primarily on this site and most of our sites, conductivity as we map it in this way is a good analogy for texture. So what we're seeing down here are very sandy soils right next to the river, low conductivity, low salt content in those soils. These soils on the upper area, particularly right along this ridge slope though, those are higher conductivity. Is that good or bad? Well, it depends. Higher conductivity can mean that may be more fertile, but actually what we're seeing here on these eroded hillsides is the lack of organic matter, and we're getting into the eroded B horizon. So we're seeing more clay, which leads to higher conductivity right on these slopes. So in this case, high conductivity is not necessarily something that we're wanting to have, but it is an illustration of patterns that may result in a way that the farmer might wish to manage the field differentially. So what we're learning to do in much of the research and extension and teaching that I do is how to map and measure these patterns of variability, and then to use these patterns to help us to apply nutrients or other inputs on a spatial basis for improved management and efficiency. So this is a list of some of the tools that we're using in research or that farmers are using now in management to assess variability. And we start with experience. Just as you farm that field for a number of years, you get an idea of the areas that are good and not good in terms of how crops yield. The county soil surveys that have been available for many years are a resource that we really take for granted here in the U.S. Much of the rest of the world has no access to that scale of information about soils like we have here in the U.S. But then some of the other layers that we're starting to collect, many of these relate to what may be called precision farming or precision agriculture or site-specific crop management. So looking at layers of yield maps, topography, grid soil sampling, using soil sensors or crop canopy sensors to measure the status of the crop. And we're doing this at scales and time frequencies that are large scale rather than micro scale like what we've been talking about this morning.